Hi guys, welcome to Counterpoints. My name is Connor, and today we're going to be talking about why I have been dodging the Mr. Girl discourse. I've actually been notably absent and silent over the past couple of weeks as this entire thing has kind of settled, where several creators started engaging with Mr. Girl, including Rose Wrist, Destiny, and Vosh, and it's kind of opened up this whole can of worms about like platforming and ephebophilia and pedophilia and what kind of topics are off topic and how do we do responsible conversations and this, that, the other. And yeah, so I didn't want to touch this shit with a fucking 10-foot pole. I still don't, but I'm going to because fuck it. And I feel like we can break down some of the things that are making people uncomfortable. So I've also wanted to stay away because I wanted the ground to settle. I didn't know if this dude was going to pop up on the scene, do a bunch of interviews, all that kind of stuff, and then it kind of like more nefarious stuff than what is already known would be revealed, or he would self-implode under the pressure, or he would reveal even worse takes under the pressure and the scrutiny in the interviews and all that kind of stuff. And that's where I've heard mixed stuff across the board. I've heard this dude's a pedo, this dude's an ephebophile, this dude apologizes for pedos, this dude has horrific rhetoric that apologizes for pedophiles. I've heard all sorts of shit. And to be honest, the only content that I've engaged with was the first Destiny debate, in which I thought there were a interesting couple of points that I wouldn't mind going over, but I also want to separate it out and go into the discomfort and why there's discomfort, and then also break down the social issues. So just bear with me. So on the one conversation that I actually watched, it seemed like Mr. Girl was pointing towards gender abolition and the acceptance of body dysmorphia, particularly when it came to trans people. A lot of people have called him transphobic. Some people have called him transphobic specifically because his girlfriend wanted to take testosterone in order to become more androgynous and more non-binary. That's my understanding of it, and he deeply discouraged that. Said that he wasn't going to honor pronouns, said that he wasn't going to encourage her to take testosterone. And what came of that was the fact that he thought that there were a lot of people who were confused about identity, a lot of people who hated their bodies, had normal issues with their body, and people who were confused about their body and who hated their body might be pushed into, if they had more masculine features or more feminine features, they might be getting pushed into the non-binary transgender category, and then also might be taking medical risks that wouldn't be advisable without like psychological intervention. Now, that's a statement on its own that could be broken down and discussed and met with some level of nuance, but then it seemed like, at least my understanding from that conversation was, he was like, oh yeah, I think we could basically talk to every trans person, use psychology to develop treatments, and largely eliminate like transgender issues through psychological intervention, which again, shitload of trans folk, both non-binary and binary, found offensive because it basically said, fuck you, if you would have gone to therapy a little bit more, maybe you wouldn't be trans. And there's a shitty point and there's a real point. The real point is, particularly when it comes to teenagers, particularly when it comes to non-binary identity, I think we have to tread carefully when we start doing medical prescriptions about how people transition, this, that, the other. And there should be some level of questioning and pushback and introspection and meditation and therapy before you start altering your body, unless you're very specifically like, binary trans, I know I'm binary trans, I'm in the wrong place, I'm in the wrong body, I know I need to switch, I know this will alleviate, not I know, but I believe this will alleviate my body dysmorphia, this, that, the other. That, I think, stands as its own category where it could be clear, whereas with people who are like, I don't feel like I fit on either side of the spectrum, well, then I think there should be some skepticism about like medical intervention, particularly if there are consequences to that medical intervention. And going along with that point, even that's uncomfortable to say out loud because he has a second point, which is liberals and libertarian are being too liberal and too libertarian on trans issues. I think that's fair. I think it's easy as a liberal or a libertarian, which I identify as both depending on the day. It's easy to say, well, it's your body, it's your choice, you figure it out. Even if you're a teenager, consult with doctors, consult with your family, and figure out what's best for you. That's an easy thing to say. It's uncontroversial. Whereas it's a little bit harder to say, hey, some people are androgynous. Some women have masculine features. Some men have women's features. And you should be deeply introspective about what you're doing before you take any kind of drug. I think that's an okay thing to say, but I could understand why people would find that, would accuse you. I'm not saying it is transphobic, but would accuse you of transphobia for saying that because you're doubting the lived experience and the identification of people. But when we have some people in the political discourse who are going solely by self-ID, and they're also talking about self-ID being like a metaphor for transhuman identities or whatever, I think we need to pump the brakes a little bit. Maybe that's transphobic to say, but hey, guess what? I guess I'm a fucking transphobe in that respect anyways. But same things as earlier stand. I think this is part of the reason why the conversation has been so uncomfortable is because he's opened a bunch of wounds and rifts in the discourse. So these are sensitive subjects and they have to be approached with some level of sensitivity and nuance. And I've said this before and I'll say it again. If I interact with somebody, they ask me to use their pronouns, I'll use their pronouns. If they're binary trans, I'm obviously going to honor that. That's perfectly fine. I'm not a particularly religious person who uses the Bible in order to say binary trans people aren't real. I think that there's room in science for people who don't particularly identify masculine or feminine and find themselves in an in-between or an off-the-spectrum position, and they don't want to be associated with either binary category. I think that's perfectly valid, and I'll interact with everybody with the level of politeness and decorum that I would afford any other human being. And that includes being, let's just call it weird, okay? If you're a fucking helicopter or a deer gender or whatever and you want me to refer to you in a certain way, fuck it. We'll have a conversation and then we'll see if we like each other as human beings and then take it from there. So another point was that conservatives are too cruel when it comes to trans discourse, which I think this is an interesting perspective because I'm sure Mr. Girl would identify as like progressive or lefty or liberal or whatever. But his pushback against the trans identity is not coming from a conservative lens. Like, nope, there's men and women and there's nothing else and fuck you and, you have to identify this way and this, that, the other. I think he's right that there is no nuance on the conservative side either, where it's not a bimodal distribution with certain gendered affectations affecting different people differently. It's there's men and there's women and there's nothing else. And if you're outside of that spectrum, you're a freak. That's the conservative perspective. So, that's where I think that level of charitability and nuance when it comes to the conversation where he's being perhaps transphobic from a trans person's perspective, or where he's being skeptical or he has hot takes that are bad, I think you have to deal with his perspectives from their own perspective because they're not the stereotypical there's only two genders conservative perspective, right? And where that conversation really jumped the shark for me, this is what I understood from it, was him saying that he thinks that most trans people could be talked out of being trans. I think if most trans people could be talked out of being trans, then we would have already developed some therapies in order to do that. So that's weird. The other thing so let's separate that out. Mr. Girl has some hot takes when it takes to trans issues. It's a very sensitive and sore subject. It's hard to pull apart. He might have a point in some perspectives, and then he takes it way too far in other ones that makes the conversation deeply uncomfortable for anybody to interact with. Here's another thing that I'm relatively sympathetic with when it came to that conversation in particular. Being able to say things without caveats. That's an interesting thing because, as a gamer bro in the thousands and the tens, I do miss the days where I was able to have a hot take and not have to qualify it. And then we would just go into follow-up questions and follow-up answers. And I could just say what I thought and then not really qualify it. And then people would naturally extend me like, oh, you're an asshole, but not in a way where I want to kill you or deplatform you or destroy you. You're an asshole and I'm going to fight you. Or they would say, you need to qualify that shit, and here's all my follow-up questions because I'm taking you in some level of good faith and charitability. I miss that. I miss those days, and I'm sympathetic to that. But here's where I've evolved. I've started qualifying. Sorry, I need to grab a dog. I've started qualifying my takes and being sensitive to the perspectives of others when I'm saying wild shit because I want it to be received. And then my messages, while still containing the same content, are better received amongst communities who would otherwise hate me for having those takes. And I think that's an important communicative skill that allows you to be tactful and received in places that would typically hate you, And I don't know, while I'm envious of the days where I got to say whatever I want unqualified and people would extend me some level of charitability, I also don't like what kind of brings me to this next point. I've had half a dozen to a dozen progressive people say like, "Hey, you haven't talked about Mr. Girl. Hey, you haven't talked about his hot take. You haven't talked about this. You haven't talked about that." As a centrist or somebody who typically identifies with like the liberal or libertarian label, it seems like you and Destiny are in a decent chunk of cohesion. So it's weird that you're not saying anything. And then on top of that, I am deeply uncomfortable because I have previous child sex abuse. And this dude is just saying, or I'm trans, and this dude is just saying some wild shit. So I'm trying to feel out where everybody is because, frankly, I'm pissed off with his hot takes and the fact that people are platforming him and they're not challenging him sufficiently. I seriously, half a dozen to a dozen DMs on Twitter with that same vein. And for me, this is where I'm sympathetic to the people who are either trans or survivors of child sex abuse, where they're literally saying, I need the qualification. I need you to tell me where you are before and after. I need you to think about the way that I'm going to perceive what you're saying, because basically I have an emotional trauma that you're ignoring and trampling on through the way that you're verbalizing your arguments, and you're a fucking asshole. So I like people in general. So just because I'm selfishly wanting to go back to the days where I can just say whatever the fuck I want without qualification, and then people just kind of got to deal with it or challenge me, still sympathetic to that perspective. Sorry, a second. Hey, what's up? Absolutely. Can I have like another 5 to 10 minutes? Okay. Sorry, I'm just in the middle of literally shooting a show. He's in the living room. Okay. I love you. I'll catch you in a second. Bye. Wife's a little sick, so I gotta get her some soup. Anyways, and I didn't want to ignore her because I didn't want her to panic. So with those people, as sympathetic as I am to the people who want to have hot takes and don't want to qualify, I am more sympathetic to the people who are affected by those takes without qualification. So for me, it's this balancing act of care between these different groups of people, and I don't know where to fucking land. And to be honest, that's kind of like half of what this video is not being sure where to land and kind of waiting for it to explode. That's kind of where I'm at. But I think there's another portion of this that needs to be addressed, because the discomfort is dealing with child sex abuse, pedophilia, and ephebophilia, which are all hot button issues in our circles. And so child sex abuse, I think that's self-explanatory, people getting molested as children. Pedophilia, basically people being sexually interested in prepubescent children. Ephebophilia, where people are sexually interested in either pubescent or mid or late term, late pubescent children for sex. You know, basically people 13 to 17 thinking that that's sexually attractive. And I think we have to address this. I think the discomfort with breaking apart the subject is that whenever we bring a discourse about from a leftist lens or a progressive lens, often the impulse is to break down social categories and taboos and all that kind of stuff. But what's been interesting to me is a lot of progressives and a lot of leftists have, reached out to me with being hugely discomforted by people bringing up the subject, because I think instinctively they know that what would come next if this becomes a discourse over prolonged periods of time is people trying to break down the social categories and the social norms. And I think we have to articulate why we have the social categories and the social norms from a pretty logical, common sense perspective. That way younger people or people who haven't considered it or whatever would be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That's why we have this. And so to make it as not weird as possible, I think I can address it from my perspective. That way I'm the avatar of sexual interest, and that way it makes sense. So we're not talking about fucking teenage girls or panties or teenage strip clubs or whatever the fuck that Vosh and Mr. Girl discussion was, right? So, number one, I think we can just leave pedophilia off the table. Don't even need to talk about it, because basically what's going on is if you want to have sex with prepubescent children, those people cannot consent. there's something productively wrong with you, whether it's your personal abuse or some kind of genetic flaw or some kind of issue, pedophilia, having sexual engagement with people who have not gone through puberty at all, off the table. Leave it off the table. And frankly, I think non-offending pedophiles should be able to go to therapists with the understanding that they'll have some level of like HIPAA protection, where they'll have medical protection in order to admit their attraction, but then receive psychological and maybe medicinal assistance to deal with those urges. But then any offending pedophiles, pretty much the same social stigma and derision and jail time that we currently have for pedophiles, perfectly comfortable with. It's a grave social offense that needs to carry the weight of a grave social offense, and it should be going forward. And I think anybody who makes apologia in order to basically say, nope, you can have sex with prepubescent kids, or they can understand consent more than you think, or this, that, the other, those people just have to be shoved right the fuck out of the Overton window. Like, not interested, fuck you. And if it does come down to a actually aggressive social movement that's interested in like kind of like integrating that into our part of society, I think the normies and the moderates and the aggressive people when it comes to child sex abuse need to stand up and basically scream fuck you in their face and maybe get a little aggressive with like rhetoric and politics. So that's number one. So pedophilia, I think we can safely push away. Now, the ephebophilia, attraction to teenagers, basically, I'll address from a personal lens so it gets as little weird as possible, okay? So I first became like a sexually aware or a sexual creature when I was 11 to 13. That's when I first started being interested in these things, but obviously I wasn't physically developed into a physically mature person. That's just when that hormonal response kicked in. And for me, I was kind of a late bloomer. That I kind of kicked in 12, 13 range, where I did have friends who kicked in at like 11, right? And so obviously right there, even if things are functional, I shouldn't be engaging in any kind of behavior because I'm not physically developed. I'm not mentally developed. I'm not emotionally developed. It's not time. Okay? It's not time for that, for that at all. I need a few years in order to come into my own physically and deal with those impulses on my own. Okay? So 11 to 13, I think, throw that into the pedophilia category, where no matter how physically developed somebody looks, no, you're too fucking young. Shut the fuck up. Don't, deal with your urges on your own, and you should be not interacting with anybody else in that way at this time, regardless of whether or not they're a peer or an adult, okay? Throw that into that category, right? And then 13 to 16 is really that developmental stage where you're figuring things out. You're starting to go on dates, like cute little dates where you hold hands and you go to the movies and this, that, the other, and then you break up because they listen to the wrong music or some shit like that. It's a time of development and being awkward and being weird, and it should be done with peers. And the reason why it should be done with peers, any movie dates or whatever, is because their lack of experience and their peer relationship with you. Number one, it's a huge opportunity for social development in order to learn how to interact with members of the same gender or opposite gender, or social dynamics and friend groups and all that kind of stuff. That's all an important developmental stage, so it shouldn't be interfered with by an adult. And then number two, if you're interacting with peers, the potential for power dynamic abuse is reduced significantly. Now, of course, we all dealt with manipulative sociopaths in our teenage years when it came to dating and all that kind of stuff, and people who played the game, or they were players, or they were cheaters, or this, that, the other, or they were more experienced and they were more prone to abuse and all that kind of stuff. We all dealt with those people, but part of that age was figuring out who those people were and dealing with them accordingly. If there was a educational roadmap on how to have healthy relationships, I think that's something that could be taught in a sex ed class or taught from an adult to a kid. But I don't think that adults should be interacting in that way at all. It's a time of personal development with peers who are as likely to know or not know what they're doing, and where the power dynamic potential for abuse is low. Okay? That's my perspective on the issue. Now, when I turned 16, that's probably, I was kind of a late bloomer. 16, 17 was when I came into my own, relatively speaking, physically. And I do remember there was a really attractive teacher who everybody had a crush on, who was in her mid to late 20s. And of course, to us, she's like fucking 40, like might as well be 40. But you see those stories where like a teacher interacts with a student sexually. And at that point, I still think it would absolutely be inappropriate for a 20-year-old or a mid 20-year-old or a late 20-year-old to interact with a 16-year-old, because basically you're talking about vast gaps in knowledge and experience. And so that's why I am perfectly comfortable with 16 being the age of consent with Romeo and Juliet laws on the back end, where it says like an 18-year-old and a 16-year-old can date, or a 17-year-old and a 19-year-old can date, particularly if they have a pre-existing relationship, or a 16-year-old and a 50-year-old can date. Like that kind of thing, where the proximity and age and maturity eliminates the potential for power dynamic abuse. And that's really what we're talking about. And I think, again, to reemphasize this point, I think the reason why everybody is so uncomfortable about talking about this issue is because basically when we start talking about these issues for social categorization and how we interact with things, the typical discourse leads to breaking down that social category. That is not my purpose. My purpose is to reinforce it and to articulate specifically why we have these categories, why they're good for maintenance, and why they're good for the young people, and why the old people who want to fuck teenagers need to shut the fuck up and move on with their lives. And so this is kind of where we get into a spot. We're gonna name drop Keemstar, right? Dude's 40, and he's obsessed with fucking 19-year-olds. At 18, you are not done socially and sexually developing, right? You're going to be developing for another 25 years, or you're going to be developing until age 25. But 16 to 18 is still like, if you're swimming in a pool, swimming in the shallow end, right? Maybe with your little floaties on and you're figuring things out and you're having relationships and you minimize the potential for some bigger kid to fucking come and dunk your fucking head into the fucking water because there's a lifeguard there. And then at 18, you're swimming in the deep end, right? And again, it's not because you're the strongest swimmer. It's because it's time for you to sink or swim on your own and to try to reconcile with the world, and also to recognize those people who will use power and money to abuse you individually. And I think that the social stigma, unfortunately, I literally criticized Keemstar for dating or wanting to date fucking 19-year-olds or whatever. And a whole bunch of people responded to me like, oh, well, he's rich and this, that, the other. Why are you hating if everybody's an adult? I'm hating because if there's a 20-year age gap and he's going from 19-year-old to 19-year-old to 19-year-old, then those aren't human beings to him. He's not having a relationship with those people. He's using them physically for sex, and that's it. And that's a toxic and shitty way to live. Now, if an 18-year-old wants to consent to that kind of behavior and they're like, oh, this is my adventure time, I'm going to go fuck a famous person on YouTube or Twitch or this, that, the other, then they're an adult and they can make their own decision. But I think there should continue to be a social stigma where if somebody is dating 20 years outside of their age range, you should be like, bro, like, why are you taking advantage of people who literally are coming on to the adult scene yesterday? Something's fucking wrong with you, right? And from the inverse, you should be educating those 18 and 19-year-olds and be like, yo, has this been like a 30 or a 40-year-old who's had dozens of relationships with young people? Chances are they're just using you for sex, and they're going to dump you within a couple of months because they're going to get bored and they're going to want to be basically sleeping with another 18 or 19-year-old. So if you want to invite that kind of horrific shit into your life, go ahead, but you're kind of a fucking idiot, and this is why we stigmatize your relationship and criticize you. I think it's perfectly fine to stigmatize and socially criticize in that way. And if anything, I think we all need to get, not everybody's going to be on the same page. I would like it if everybody was on that page, where it's like 13 and under completely off limits for anything physical to be happening. 13 to 16, you can go on little cute movie dates with peers. 16 to 18, you can start to figure shit out, but there's going to be that Romeo and Juliet 2 to 3 year window with who you're interacting with. And then after 18, we're going to socially and culturally pressure you to date peers, but ultimately you're an adult and you have to make your own decisions and you kind of got to start swimming without your floaties, right? I think that's safe. So anyways, I think at 25 to 30, once your brain is fully developed and you've had the ability to come into your own and all that kind of stuff, don't give a shit anymore. Don't care. If you're a fucking 30-year-old and you're like, I was abused in the power dynamic by a 50-year-old, you've had a decade to figure it out. Figure the fuck out, right? Like, that's on you at that point. And so that's where, like, let's say older dude, 50-year-old or 70-year-old or something like that, loses his wife to a widow thing, and he wants to have fun and, you know, be with younger people. And then some 30-year-old wants to be with an older man who has a lot of money. I don't give a shit. You're fucking 25, you're 30. You figure it the fuck out. You do whatever you got to do, right? But that's where the social protection of the younger people is development and investment in the next generation, which is why we have to be responsible and we have to be sensitive and we have to be intelligent. And I think the discomfort that we've all experienced with this discourse is the fact that, again, I'm not saying Mr. Girl is trying to do this intentionally, but whenever a discourse is brought up, oftentimes, specifically when it comes to leftists, it's not to reinforce social institutions or cultural expectations, it's to break them down. So when I have a bunch of child sex abuse survivors saying, I am horrifically uncomfortable with the irresponsible discourse around this thing because I'm worried that they're going to start breaking down the social categorization, it's my job as a Burkean conservative or whatever the fuck you want to call it, centrist liberal, to explain why these social institutions exist, what the potential for abuse is, and why we should reinforce this social institution. And by the way, if there was a 30-year-old or a 40-year-old who was like, it's my right as an American to fuck 18-year-olds, I would be like, you should be on a watch list. Like, something's wrong with you. Your mom didn't give you enough hugs. Your dad didn't give you enough hugs. He didn't play catch with you enough. There's something fucking wrong with you if it's your social obligation, or it's your social right that you have to enact in order to sleep with people that you don't view as fully developed human beings, just as playthings to mess around with because you're bored and you're waiting to die. You did not develop fully socially and should be recognized as such. So, anyways, that's how I feel about that shit. So, yeah, I'm good with that. Playing with this stuff feels like skating on super thin ice. Having this discourse at all feels like being on super thin ice. I don't think this is a social taboo or a social category or a legal thing that needs to be broken down. If anything, I think the social conservatives need to, social conservatives who like the status quo need to get better at articulating why we have the status quo. Hopefully Mr. Girl and the surrounding ephebophilia, pedophilia discourse, hopefully this is a fluke and it dies back down. But if we do see a continuation of MAPS discourse or pedophilic discourse or anybody who actually has any kind of social clout who actually is arguing for the abolition of these social categories and social pressures, I think Burkean conservative centrist liberals and people of goodwill who want to protect younger people and allow them to come into their own without social influence from adults, I think we have to understand why we want what we want, enforce it, put cultural pressure on people that break that norm, who are doing things that are otherwise legal, and socially castigate and criticize people who are trying to break down that norm to their own advantage, and people who are trying to break down that categorization because they think they would be able to seize a social opportunity themselves within the paradigm that they have created. And by the way, that's my final point before I let you go. I think the reason why everybody is so uncomfortable is when you start breaking down a social category, when it comes to the separation of sexual consent, when it comes to teenagers and adults, the reason why I think the presumed motivation for adults who are arguing for this thing is that you can't find peers to interact with on a sexual level. And so you want to break down the social categorization so you can capitalize on the new destigmatized fucking teenagers opportunity so you can find a partner or slew of partners to either use or abuse or to partner with. But realistically, you should be focusing on developing yourself socially so you can find a partner who's within your peer group. And that's why everybody's uncomfortable. You need to develop yourself to be a partner worthy of finding someone in your peer group who wants you. And yeah, focus on that. Stop trying to fuck teenagers. And don't fuck kids. Didn't think we had to say that, but we did. And so now we have. Fuck. I'm not even going to shout myself out. Fuck this video. I'm actually sad that I had to make it. Bye.